everybody. Good morning. For those who are joining live, my name is Hanna Naima McCloskey. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the founder and CEO of Fearless Futures. I'll start by saying that I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for my first talk of 2023 to share with you why the business case is bankrupt when it comes to driving forward inclusion and equity in the workplace. Before I get started, though, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first up, I would like to offer a particular content warning that this talk does touch on specific examples of inequitable realities that marginalised folks may experience. So please do take care of yourself and do what you need to do throughout this talk. The second thing to say is that this talk is recorded. However, all attendees will remain anonymous throughout as a video and speakers are turned off. And if you do submit a question and we do come to answer it in the Q&A portion, you'll be kept anonymous as we respond to your question as well. So captions have been activated and you can press show captions right at the bottom of your Zoom webinar window to enable them for yourself. And then finally, on the kind of functionality piece, there will be a Q&A at the end of the talk, and you're welcome to submit questions, though, throughout as they occur to you, but we'll capture them all right at the end. And then a piece on context. When discussing through this talk structurally advantaged racialized identities, this talk is very much situated in the global north, and so the term white will generally be used. This won't always be relevant in other global contexts, though the overarching principle will remain. So I'm going to get started now on the kind of thrust of this talk. If we can just explain the business case, diversity and inclusion will be more likely. This is a common refrain in companies and in the DEI mainstream. For decades, DEI and business communities have peddled the dogma that if the business case for diversity was presented to leaders, they would be compelled to act. And this is very much one of the kind of mainstream DEI tactics. And we would be hard pressed, I think, to find an organization that doesn't deploy this concept at some point in their internal or external messaging. In fact, anyone who has been a DEI practitioner or has simply tried to make the case for DEI work has probably mentioned the business case argument. In my early years, I too engaged in it. So this is not a talk about how everyone who's done this or is still doing this is a really bad person and should be ashamed of themselves for deploying this approach. Instead, it's really for us to dig in and get real about the roots of this particular argument and the implications of using it. No argument is neutral. And so while at the end of this talk, you might still think that tactically it makes sense for you and your context to keep using the business case, which you are entitled to do. I'm not the business case police, I assure you. It's also important that when we do use it, if we do, we're doing so in full recognition of what's going on when we do use it. So I also want to acknowledge that the business case has been made extremely clear. McKinsey told us in 2015 that companies in the top quartile for gender or racial and ethnic diversity are more likely to have financial returns above their national industry medians. A Harvard Business Review article in 2021 confirmed that adding women to the C-suite improved how companies think and their capacity for innovation. Leaders have been provided with the link between profit, innovation, decision-making, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and yet not that much has changed. By leaning into the belief that business leaders are rational, singularly growth-minded people who respond to data and act accordingly, the business case aims to be a shortcut to winning the hearts and minds of those in charge, as well as others across workplace contexts. And it does sound really super in practice, but it does ignore four key dynamics. The first is leaders' self-interest. The second is that business has relied on marginalised people for profit, and in many cases still does. The third is that there may be cost involved in doing DEI work that will be impossible to recoup. And that fourth, narratives around the business case are dehumanizing. So I'll expand upon all of this now. So first of all, leaders' self-interest. When we look at who is in leadership positions, we see the outcomes of inequity. These roles are overwhelmingly occupied by people from dominant groups, or what we might call structurally advantaged groups. White people in the context of the global north, middle class people, heterosexual people, cisgender people, non-disabled people. Since 2000, there have been 151 white women and people of colour appointed as CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. In the UK in 2020, there were just 11 people of colour in the role of chair or CEO of those who disclosed their race or ethnicity. Most people who hold structurally advantaged identities, some of which I had listed earlier, on an individual level, likely don't want to give up the power that they have been afforded by the status quo. The business case has been presented as a cure to this issue of self-interest. But while the data tells us that the benefits of DEI will be company-wide, the necessary changes to get there will likely impact people individually and at the top along the way, whatever processes and implementation is going on. So the business case is presented as a rational approach that can counter human emotion, but it ignores the fact that business leaders are still human. And for many of them, and I think this is a kind of normal human phenomena, there will be deep resistance to the reality that certain leaders have achieved their roles and positions in part based on identities that they hold that are structurally advantaged in society. So many of these very people who hold the purse strings for DEI work will hold beliefs about their merit alone and will do everything they can to protect that reality, which, you know, is going to be a surprise to nobody here, myself or those of you in attendance. It will unsurprisingly include no action for DEI, no matter what the numbers say. So this brings me to my second point. Business has relied on marginalised people for profit, and in many cases still does. The business case argument suggests that marginalised people should be hired because profit can be generated by their existence in the company to aid the bottom line. That is the kind of crux of the argument. This argument ignores that many businesses hire marginalised people already, right now, as they are more readily exploitable and can be paid poverty wages. Restaurants benefit from diversity because marginalised people receive the lowest wages. There's a report called Ending Jim Crow in America's Restaurants, and it describes how waiters at high-end restaurants may earn salaries 5 times greater than those of employees washing dishes, clearing tables, and prepping food in the very same establishment. Now, that pay distinction might be expected, right? The troubling part is the huge racial divide the researchers found between the highest and the lowest paid restaurant workers. Basically, white employees overwhelmingly filled jobs with the heftiest salaries, while Latinx people, Black people, and other people of marginalised races and ethnicities occupy positions with pay closer to the poverty level. The divide is gender-based too. White men across the restaurant industry are paid on average, and this is in the US, roughly a quarter more than women, whether they're white or women of colour. We might take another example. Companies that situate themselves within the gig economy in the UK also benefit from diversity to their bottom line. And by gig economy, I mean, food delivery apps, riding apps, cleaning apps, and so on. In the UK, nearly 160,000 racially and ethnically marginalised workers are on 0 hours contracts. That's around 1 in 6 of the 1 million people who are on these contracts. But that's even though racially and ethnically minoritized workers in the UK make up just 1 in 9 employees overall. So they're disproportionately in this precarious work. Across Europe, women, migrants, and disabled people, as well as those living across multiple of these inequities, are all also more likely to be in insecure and precarious work. The business case would have us praising these companies for their diversity, right? And that exists because of the benefit marginalised people bring to the bottom line, which in this instance and it should be no mystery to any of us, it's because they can be paid less. The bottom line would look smaller if these workers were paid far better. The low pay and insecurity for certain marginalised communities coexists with working for companies that might also be highly valuable as determined by shareholder returns or IPO valuations, for example. Many of the profitable, wealthy companies who rely on significant low-paid, insecure workers couldn't exist without these workers. Having low-paid, insecure workers is in fact essential to the business structure that makes it possible for other people in the business to take home big salaries with a greater degree of job security. And those staff are, unsurprisingly, more likely to be white, middle class, non-disabled, and to be men. It would be remiss of me at this point to be silent on naming capitalism. And I say that even though there really isn't time to do a deep dive into the mechanics of this economic system. A fairly widely understood feature of capitalism, though, and capitalism is a global economic system with different dynamics, though, depending on geography. So a kind of an understood feature of capitalism is capitalism's production in concert with other oppressions of different categories of people who can benefit others through their labor. So capitalism produces different categories of people who can benefit others through their labor. In this regard, capitalism requires inequality because value and wealth are effectively transferred from people who are made poor to those who are made rich. We cannot have one without the other. We can see the connections between racism, sexism, and capitalism, for example, and how it relates to the business case through history too. Slavery was maintained precisely because of its business case. Exploitation and extraction is profitable. The question, therefore, is, if extraction and exploitation are profitable and easier because they're facilitated and encouraged by legislative backdrops in many parts of the world, and on the other hand, we have DEI work, which is hard, even if it could increase a company's bottom line, why would companies opt for the latter? Arguments that focus on business profitability, therefore, are rarely inherently beneficial to marginalised people as a practical matter. How profitable something is to business is not in direct correlation at all, really, to whether that business positively changes the material conditions of the people working within it. If the business case benefit does emerge, it's often those individuals already in positions of power who will reap the material rewards. Owners of the company, senior people who receive large bonuses or company stocks, for example. In this regard, the very purpose of the business case is to further compensate and reward financially those who have already gained from the status quo. What we're seeing here is that the business case doesn't actually explicitly center marginalized people, and that rarely is an inclusive or equitable first step. So to my third key dynamic, there may be cost involved in doing DEI work that will be impossible to recoup. The reality of DEI is that attracting, recruiting, and retaining marginalized communities as a very kind of minimum baseline goal or requirement will almost always require investment of time and money. You may need to redesign your office so that disabled people can move through them with ease. You might need to reformat your bathrooms to be gender neutral. Your sick pay policy might need to change, and your parental leave policy will probably cost you more money. But why should marginalised employees have more to prove and a greater burden on their shoulders to justify their existence in your workplace than someone else who happens to have identities that society structurally advantages? Surely they shouldn't. The reality that doing meaningful DEI work will cost more money than doing no DEI work, when coupled alongside the business case argument, effectively puts a pound, dollar, euro sign sort of hovering above a marginalized person's head saying, show us our return on investment, because that's what the business case argues. And what's the potential consequence of this? What if you do happen to have hired a range of folks from marginalized backgrounds one year, and then the team does less well? If the business case is the prevailing internal narrative for their existence in your company, what could the conclusion be? It might be that these people aren't fulfilling their alleged promise. It might be that there is backlash from people across the company, that time and effort and money was spent on DI to hire people and only for the bottom line to be hit. And maybe this can be rationalized away by leadership who can describe other economic forces. But the business case for diversity argument sets up this possible critique and a container where a backlash has been generated is definitely not helpful to minoritized people. They will become the scapegoat for these wider decisions. And so this brings me to the kind of final argument. Narratives around the business case are dehumanizing. They're dehumanizing because they value underrepresented groups solely based on their potential to benefit business, and because this added value derives from their experience of oppression itself. By reinventing and repackaging what can sometimes be the pain and trauma of oppression into profit for shareholders, the business case argument essentializes and therefore dehumanizes folks who are on the sharp end of oppression and marginalization. And this really does betray inclusion and equity principles. There is some research that the business case argument may actually turn off marginalized people in any case. And perhaps it's because they're identifying this dehumanization, right? Researchers Georgiak and Rattan in 2022 found that among marginalized people in their study, that those that read the business case for diversity on websites reported that they were less likely to feel belonging to the company, more concerned that they would be stereotyped, and more worried that the company would view them as interchangeable with other members of their group. It is dehumanizing to be the subject of study after study, to have to prove your worth to actually be in a particular workplace. It leaves us with the question of, why is there no study about the benefits of white people to business, or men, or non-disabled people? No one has thought to conduct that research, and why? Is it because institutions don't invest time or money to research things that are presumed to be absolutely certain, just as the Earth orbits the sun? The absence of this research, that at least that anyone's engaging with in the mainstream, leads people to believe or interpret that white people, for example, are a natural phenomena when they exist disproportionately in leadership roles. It tells us that these are the groups we should expect to see in valuable places, for example. And yet we know this isn't true. Inequity is not a natural phenomenon. It is designed, it is orchestrated, and it is maintained. So let's do a thought experiment here. Imagine that an enormous peer-reviewed study was conducted that ascertained that men in company leadership roles threatened business profitability, led to lower performance, reduced innovation, and limited creativity. Now imagine there were multiple studies conducted and all pointed to similar conclusions for white people, non-disabled people, non-LGBTQIA+ people, and so on. What do we think would happen? Now, let's be clear, that research will never be conducted, but perhaps there is other evidence that we could draw upon. Let's think of an example of the recent past. In 2008, the world economy came crashing down with the demise on the 15th of September of Lehman Brothers. It instigated a string of urgent steps from central banks and governments to stabilize the banking sector. The consequences for the global economy of the significant, dangerous and harmful realities lived out by bankers, fueled by a commitment to ever-increasing profits, led to millions of people losing their homes, and over a decade of public austerity played out across multiple global economies, with consequences right to this day to ordinary people. To my knowledge, the devastation of the 2008 crash or multiple predecessors, the dot-com bust, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and other in-between damaging economic events, did not in their aftermath create a culture of suspicion around whether men, and in some of these cases, largely white men, can in fact be trusted to make important economic decisions and lead companies, and to be well paid for doing so. This was not a legitimate concern for hiring managers anywhere in any sector, even with this correlation and this very serious impact that really was global, was widespread. I mean, you couldn't think of any worse impact. And why is that? Because those who inhabit structurally advantaged identities are on the whole given greater access to messing up and failing. They are granted some aspect of their humanity in this way. And I just want to be really clear on the point I'm making here. I do not believe, and nor does the work of Fearless Futures endorse, the notion that it is the condition of any group with structurally advantaged identities to act or think in any specific way or to be inherently harmful. That would be to essentialize these groups as having some innate quality. And this logic should be resisted for all social groups, whether structurally advantaged or structurally disadvantaged. What I would say instead is that we want a world where everyone has access to messing up royally, and for it not to be a stain on their identity or a group to which they belong, because to mess up is what it is to be human. Given that some people need a business case and others just get to be present without any supporting research, I'm not sure the business case sets us up for that paradigm of equal opportunity to mess up royally, which is part of being human and what we all deserve. So it's for these four reasons combined that we might now have a better sense of why the business case also hasn't worked, despite the evidence itself being very clear. So you're probably all sitting there and wondering, well, what do we do instead then? You've told us this is terrible to do. What should we do? So I'm going to do that. The business case ultimately is a sloppy approach because it's presenting itself as a quick win. And I also want to reiterate that I do have deep empathy for people who are at their wits' end in their organizations and are relying on the business case as some sort of magic bullet. There's no shame here, just to reiterate, in terms of having used it in the past or indeed going forward to continue using it. And this talk isn't to guilt anyone at all. It's merely to focus on the impact of the approach so that we don't see it as neutral, because nothing is. And so if you do use it, you're using it choicefully, intentionally, and with full clarity around potential consequences for it. So there are two things to do instead. One, focus on depth instead of breadth, and two, focus on structures, not individuals. Now, turning to depth instead of breadth. Meaningful work, whatever you're doing in any instance, rarely happens when we rely on quick wins and seemingly innocent shortcuts to get the job done. And that's what the business case ultimately proposes. Instead, DEI leaders need to dig in and lean into one-on-one conversations with senior leaders to locate those who are prepared to roll their sleeves up and do this work properly. These one-to-one conversations allow you to speak from your heart, put your reputation on the line with people, and identify the various entry points for different people as they come to this work. It won't be one size fits all as we invite people into doing deep DEI work. DEI leaders need to find out what it is for the various people they're wanting to build alongside. You need to find out what energizes and animates them in this arena. It is going to be different for different people based on their particular social location, their interests, and things that have occurred to them in their lives potentially. Now, what are the consequences of this depth over breadth approach that I'm recommending? Well, in the first instance, it means that the startup phase of any project of transformation will fundamentally take longer. And that's because it's more personal. And this work, it really is personal work. And I've learned that over the years. It's deeply personal work, and it's human connection and human relationship work. So it will take you longer. But you know what you'll have? You'll have greater trust between those that you're working with. There'll be greater dedication among you as you engage in what is extremely hard work. And having trusting, dedicated early adopters to build alongside is absolutely priceless and worth that investment in your own personal time and reputation to collect and gather and harness. Ultimately, building with just a few senior leaders who are committed, eager to learn and ready to act is far more powerful for transformation than countless superficially engaged people, which is all the business case argument can deliver. We've seen this in organization after organization where there is deep capacity building and investment in a small number of people who, do have disproportionate organizational influence, responsibility, and power. That's where really exciting things can happen to optimize for equity. So this takes me to the second thing that we can do instead, and that's to focus on structures, not individuals. So the business case is a tactic. It's rooted in quickly winning the hearts and minds of those who aren't instinctively inclined to care. So what hearts and minds tactics don't tend to realize is that transformative change at scale can't happen through all individuals in a company, all changing the way that they think all at the same time. It's just not possible. Depending on the size of the organization, and if it's particularly large, it would take too long, both in terms of timelines and the duration of the education necessary to get people to a particular endpoint. It would be very costly, depending again on the size of the organization, and simply wouldn't uniformly work. Education, when it's done well, robustly, anti-oppression education, when it is done well in this manner, simply cannot be mandated and coercive. People need to come with some sort of intrinsic curiosity or motivation to learn something. And that's a really essential starting point. So saying all individuals in a company engaging in, instructor-led training for everyone over, it's just, and I say this as an education organization, so believe me, I'm very thoughtful about what is powerful and what won't be. But there is another way that can work in tandem with capacity building in a kind of, and I say capacity building in a very thoughtful, disciplined, focused way that isn't mandated or coercive. And that's where we focus on structures instead of individuals. And what I think is really useful, because people use the word structures and structural a lot, and before I kind of go any further, I think it would be useful if I kind of give an analogy that might help bring this kind of nebulous concept to life. So one way of thinking about structures is through the analogy of a transport network. So that is to say the roads, the roundabouts, junctions, traffic lights, stop signs, pavements, speed limits, speed cameras, and so on, the whole thing. A transport network is the infrastructure for how people move through and experience the roads. And this is what structures are. And in our society and at large, and therefore in companies, there are equivalent transport networks that advantage some people and disadvantage others based on their identities. Now, when you're driving on the roads, for most of us at least, and I'm going to go with a kind of average anecdotal assessment here, you don't need to constantly be thinking about how you enter the roundabout, because roundabouts, I've realized, are designed so that you enter it with the road moving in the direction around which you need to travel round the roundabout. As you approach a roundabout, there are signs to get you to slow down. There are bumps on the road to doing so, which necessitate slowing down as we approach the roundabout. That, everything I've just described there, is all about how to make entry onto a roundabout as safe as possible and as unharmful as possible through its very design. Working on your internal structures means working on your internal transport network within your company and designing it to make it as unlikely as possible for harm to take place, but at its best, for it to be optimized for equitable outcomes for marginalized people that are moving through your organization. So an example of an internal structure could be your recruitment policy, right? New people move through and experience being engaged into your company through the steps of your recruitment policy. So some structural changes that you could make are as follows. All interviews are done virtually, that you automatically instigate live captioning, that you pay travel and other costs if they are required to be somewhere in person for those who can't afford it, that you ask and use people's pronouns accurately, that you do not ask people for their address, that you do not do background checks, and that you do not require people to reveal any prior criminal history, I should say. All of these integrations transform structures and optimize them for equity for marginalized folks, and they do so by changing outcomes without anyone in the process having to themselves think or have their hearts and minds changed in order to be part of that process. So redesigning internal structures to optimize for equity doesn't require mass buy-in, because it instead establishes the guardrails for what is encouraged and permissible from staff. It doesn't require rewiring of individuals' brains, because we've rewired the company instead. And this is how we can scale equity and inclusion for marginalized folks. So we can move away from the business case by doing the following two things instead: depth and breadth, and focusing on structures, not individuals. Ultimately, however, to do this work with integrity, I do want to encourage DEI leaders to simply insist that this work matters, because these people and communities matter, and that marginalized employees, current and future, deserve a workplace and a world that has as a starting point the belief that they are worthy of legitimacy, dignity, and safety. That's the starting point. Inclusion and equity in the framework of Fearless Futures is about transforming the paradigms in which we understand the world as it has been created. That is what our education is about. And what it means in practice, the action that people do, it means targeting resources at scale in organizations towards those who have been historically and who remain presently marginalized. In DEI work, the ends do not justify the means. The process itself is important. That means not articulating oppressed folks as assets to be extracted from. When inclusion is fundamentally about granting people their humanity. We cannot do it in dehumanizing ways. And so I'm very committed to this, even if you might not be by the end of this, committed to divesting from the business case, because I really do believe that it is bankrupt. So thank you all so much for your time. And it is now time to take some questions and answers, which I'm now going to review. And so if you do give me a second, because there's a kind of a tech situation here where I need to engage with the questions that have been submitted and then respond accordingly. Okay, so I'll start with a question I have here, which is, right, okay. Should we stay away from using data altogether? How can it be used in a positive way in DEI spaces? Okay, this is a very good question. So this argument is not to say that data in its entirety has no use or value when doing DEI work. This is very much specifically around business case data. But I do think we need to be cautious with data in general, because we need to ask the questions about whose interest does that data serve. I think what we see with the business case is it either serves inertia or it serves those who already benefit from the status quo. So we do need to be mindful about data and the kind of analysis that goes into putting it together, who's involved in that process, where the data comes from, and so on, and what those end goals are. There are good and bad sides to data, depending on who's collecting it. So there are very positive things about data if it's being used to make decisions about where equity isn't playing out. So you might want to think about data in terms of pay gap data, and data in particular that's done intersectionally, that really allows to explore the differences, not just between women and men or white people and marginalised races and ethnicities, but looks at all of these dimensions together, and then seeks to address the pay gap and build action around that sort of data. That is obviously extremely useful in a company context. Across society at large, there's obviously certain dangers in terms of what data is collected and by who, and because of what might be done with that data. So of course, if we think about the extreme surveillance that Muslim communities have in the UK, for example, and in the US, a project that was to collect data around where mosques are and who attended those mosques wouldn't necessarily, I would argue, probably wouldn't at all make Muslim communities safer if it's being used as part of the surveillance and anti-terrorist regime in this country, because we know it's led to the harassment, extra surveillance, disproportionate allocation to the Prevent program and so on for Muslim communities, which makes them less safe and ultimately presumes their guilt. So we need to be just really thoughtful about who's collecting the data, what we're going to do with that data, what needs are being centered in the collection of data, for example, without saying that we're going to have a complete ban on data. That, I don't think that would be very thoughtful, but we do need to be very, we do need to be intentional about the data that we're collecting and how it's going to be used. I've got a question here, and a question that actually that's, okay, here's a really exciting question. How do we center disability, especially disabled, Black, Indigenous, people of colour, in conversations and solutions of divestment from the business case for our radical and collective liberation, when society still commoditizes and systematically erases disabled people's existence daily? Woo, that's a big one. That is a big one. So first, I just want to clarify that the term Black, Indigenous people of color is a term that's specific in the United States context. Indigenous people in that context are, of course, Native Americans. And actually, it's a term that can also be used across North America, where we have First Nation peoples, for example, in Canada. Indigenous, obviously, is not relevant to the UK and has actually been weaponized in certain ways by people with some ulterior motives. But if we just talk about, those whose identities are racialized and structurally disadvantaged and who coexist with disability, I think ultimately the focus that I would have in answering that question is to really bring a spotlight, and I said I wasn't going to do this, to the ways in which capitalism discards certain people and produces different categories of worth that ultimately is kind of situated within the business case itself. I think that one of the most powerful things that we can do is recognize our collective interdependence as a way to resist the putting the monetary figure on people's head in terms of proving and proving their worth. So when we start to put numbers on people's heads, we're no longer seeing them as human at all, and we're only seeing interdependence in terms of what we can extract and gain from people, which is of course counter to any sort of justice, and I would argue disability justice as well. Recognizing our interdependence and the mutuality of our relationships, I think, is one of the most profound things that we can do. I think something we saw in the early phases of the COVID pandemic, which of course is still continuing, although has been pushed somewhat to the margins, is the nature of our interdependence. When one group suffers, others will suffer, and we perhaps never saw that quite in the profound way, or at least some people never saw it in the profound way that the pandemic brought to light. One of the things that I think is important in that framework, and it's and I think there is a disability justice piece here, is when we see ourselves as all connected, we recognize that we need to show up and fight for other people's access to dignity. I'm thinking about strikes that are occurring at this moment, nurses going on strikes because they're unable to give the care that they want to give to people in hospitals, in other caring institutions, because the conditions don't support that. So when we see our interdependence, which is, I think, again, counter to the business case argument, it says, how do we create conditions for all of us to be nurtured? How do we create conditions for all of us to have dignity and safety? I think that's probably the most exciting thing that we can do in terms of responding to the question around collective liberation, and centers, I think, disabled people, because disability shows us very clearly how interdependent we all are. And it's something that can happen to all of us at any point in our lifetimes. And so we're all in great proximity to the way society disables us. So that's a very long-winded answer that touched on capitalism and interdependence and striking nurses. And hopefully whoever submitted it gained something from that response. But all that to say, that is all, of course, counter to what a business case argument can offer for disabled people. There's a question that's just come in that I'm kind of intrigued by. And it says, interesting that you talk about one-to-one conversations. I'm being pushed to influence as many people as possible, interventions at scale. And the solution that is requested falls back onto unconscious bias. What is the best way to challenge this request? Great question. Many, many ways. So, of course, organizations want to make change at scale. And you know, one of the solutions to not using the business case is to engage in interventions at scale, but at the structural level. So that's something that's extremely important here, is that you can engage in action at scale It just needs to be at the structural level in order to have scalable, consistent outcomes. So that means, going back to that transport analogy, it means looking at your own internal transport network, your recruitment policy, promotions, talent decisions, parental leave, sick pay, physical access into the space, and so on and so forth. All the ways in which employees move physically and conceptually through your organization. By optimizing those processes and policies for equity, you will be able to make scalable change in your organization. That is absolutely certain, because structures have scaled outcomes. Now, so that's the first part. So I think you could respond and say, this is how I can make change at scale, and I can do it this way. I need to work with the people so that I can influence and get into the nitty-gritty of how to optimize for equity across those various internal structures. It will likely also cost you less money. That's something that might be of interest to whoever's pushing you in that direction. The piece around unconscious bias is that unconscious bias training has, I could go on and on about the errors with entertaining unconscious biases as a kind of meaningful way of making change in an organization. But I think the most important thing to say here is that anything that offers a kind of short, bada bing, bada boom way of getting people to think and do differently is just not a thing, really, in anything that any of us have ever done in our entire lives. It's just not a thing that shows up with the human condition or human beings as a collective. So that's something I think is a really important thing to offer back to leaders that you're engaging with. The main issue with unconscious bias as an educational tool is that it doesn't root people in a number of things. It doesn't give people a historic understanding of how we got here. That is extremely important for people to have a robust understanding of what's going on. It doesn't give people an analytical framework to understand their relation in relation to others based on their positionality, their social location, and the complex ways that those interrelate in our everyday interactions, but also the decisions that we make. And thirdly, unconscious bias presumes that everything is interpersonal, and it doesn't see systemic realities at all in terms of shaping the ways we are in relation to each other and the choices that we might make. So unconscious bias is, as an education tool, is flawed for a number of reasons. I actually do have a podcast episode from season 1 about unconscious bias and its pitfalls, and I'd be happy for us to send that out if the person that asked the question wanted to let us know who they are, or perhaps we can send over some reading for everybody after this talk and we'll pop that in there. So unconscious bias in and of itself is not a very robust way of thinking about how we challenge oppression, for the reasons that I've just shared. There are, I'm going to say, of course, there are other educational endeavors that are important, but there are a few criteria. The education itself has to be robust. It has to acknowledge systemic inequities. It has to think about how we take action, not just at the interpersonal, but at a scalable level. So, building capacity so that people know how to change their internal structures for scaled solutions. You might not know how to do that. That can be taught. That is a skill. There are tools to know how to do that. And that's something that all fits within what is very legitimate, important ways of engaging with education, and of course focusing on those who actually want to do it. If you're going to do, instructor-led training and you're going to force everyone to do that, that's often a recipe for disaster, because people that don't really want to be there will just blow it up for everyone else that does have that intrinsic motivational curiosity to participate. So there are a number of kind of dimensions to all of those pieces, and hopefully that's useful, but also happy to have a conversation if you feel like I've missed something and I didn't attend to part of it after the talk, if you get in touch. Another question's come through. Oh gosh, this is a long one, so I'm just going to have Yes. Okay. You know what? I'm going to read it out so that we all know, because I don't think I can speed read and give a summary. Many companies are going through layoffs and cost cutting, and sometimes DEI falls on the list of priorities for leaders who consider it a nice to have, right? Oftentimes, these are leaders who are heavily into the business case idea and become resistant to investing in meaningful DEI work. In this context, many companies are starting to become obsessed with DEI metrics, which are often not centering the experiences of marginalised people and community, but rather just feeding the business case narrative. What are some DEI metrics you feel are meaningful and relevant to this kind of work? Oof, that's extremely exciting. Okay. So I think you're absolutely right about in the terms of the context that you're painting at this economic moment. And I think I'll just attend to that first part. I think there are some important things that DEI leaders are going to need to do in the face of a context where perhaps budgets are going to be much tighter. The first thing I would say in terms of what can be done when that's the context you're in is I'm turning again to the structural change piece, which is how you scale things at low cost, because it will take far fewer people involved to optimize for equity across your various internal structures than it would to, you know, run an education program for everyone that's, you know, 7 days long and whatever it might be, which is the kind of level of investment you need of people's time to fundamentally shift things and do that deep capacity building. So focusing on structures, I think is going to be really important in that context. What are some DEI metrics you feel are meaningful and relevant to this kind of work? What I really wish we had is my colleague Ruby to answer this question, because she's developed our new ecosystem audit, which ultimately is looking at quite complex metrics, to be honest, that aren't as straightforward as a percentage and so on, because she's actually, our audit methodology looks at various push and pull factors at the very cultural level of an organization, to really establish what is working for you when it comes to inclusion, what isn't, as well as looking at some more as well as qualitatively establishing and evaluating your internal structures and how they contribute to wider cultures as well. So I wish she was here, but alas, she isn't. I think there are some useful DEI metrics that will give an indication of what's going on. And I think what's really important is if they're individual, we've got to look at things in a complete picture to know what's going on without getting alarmist about one or two things that might pop up. One thing I think is extremely interesting is the use of non-disclosure agreements with respect to sexual harassment and other forms of harassment in the workplace. How frequently are they used? Are they active? And what might that tell us about what's going on? I think that's a really exciting and interesting avenue to explore. I think pay equity is really useful, but I must urge people when they go down that path that doing so intersectionally is really, really important in order to establish the actions that you're going to take as a consequence from the data that you ultimately gather. And one thing I will say as a caveat to the entire talk that I gave didn't really acknowledge, and that's because that's the way the data of the business case is generally articulated and presented, and I was kind of engaged in that paradigm to some extent. It doesn't acknowledge the reality of how different structurally advantaged and disadvantaged identities interact in the same human being, which does shape our interests and the decisions that we do make. It's not as simple as binary or this or you're that. Human beings' social identity is far more complex and nuanced, and when we think about it on a global level, also can shift in certain global arenas based on historical context and so on. So that's something that's missing that I do think is actually really important for us all to acknowledge. The talk didn't, because of the paradigm that I was kind of rebutting up, I was kind of in a rebuttal against, which shows us the dangers of paradigms when they're when they don't do exactly what we want them to do. So so pay equity and non-disclosure agreements I think are extremely useful. I think looking at promotion rates, so who is being valued and why in an organization, I think is extremely useful to think about. and looking at that again, intersectionally is the name of the game when it comes to the data that you're collecting at any point. Sometimes this might mean you need to do a lot more work to get your organization into a state where it does have enough data across the piece in order to look at it intersectionally. There might be some pre-work to do, but looking at it intersectionally at the point at which you are ready to do that data gathering for a particular piece of analysis is going to be extremely important. So promotions, retention in general, like why people leave, and so, you know, exit interview data, I think is also really important and useful. So those are kind of things I think that are easy to gather, that don't require a whole kind of hoo-ha around them, but I think do give an indication around what's the organization suppressing, what particular cultures of who gets valued and who doesn't are there, and also create very useful ways of targeted action after that data has been collected. Right, I'm looking at the time. We've got 2 minutes. Okay, I've just had a question. Okay, what types of assistance, programming, or support does Fearless Futures offer to small business owners who are looking to create more equitable structures from the beginning of a new business venture? Blimey. Well, look, the good news is if you're just starting something, and I'd say that's whether you're a small organization or you're a large organization, sometimes kind of starting afresh is the most exciting and powerful because you don't have any kind of expectations around what's going to happen. I think as a new business, it's really important, and it can be very hard when you're starting out, but to spend time thinking about your policies and to be really intentional about how you want them to be, rather than letting them you know, occur and then having to fix them later down, and then fix them down the line. So being really intentional from the beginning, I think, is really, really important for anyone, what they're doing, but particularly if you have the opportunity to start with a blank slate, is to be really intentional. For small organizations, potentially with low, you know, with low budget, our e-learning is probably the most highest level of robustness with lowest level of cost that we offer, which can be very useful, both if you're a small business, but also, you know, if you're struggling with budgets in general. One thing I think people might ask is, well, Hannah, you said, you know, no mandated, no coercive learning, which I totally believe in. There's a distinction between doing learning that's a requirement in public with other colleagues and doing it by yourself. I think that's really important just to note here, in case you think that I'm a hypocrite, which I could be in other areas, but not in this one. Doing deep anti-oppression education in the container with other people is a very vulnerable process, and people where there's a lot of deep resistance can often generate some heightened levels of emotion, which can sometimes really derail and kind of get things off track, which can be very damaging for others in the group that really want to participate. That's very different to doing something autonomously in a self-guided way. You have an opportunity to kind of blow off steam, throw a book at your sofa if you're really struggling with it, and you don't have that same level of heightened visibility as you work through your emotions with challenging content that you do have when you're in an instructor-led context. So there's a really big distinction there that I think is really important for folks in terms of how they understand what they might offer and to who in their organizational context. So if you are a small organization, I think focusing again on your policies up front, thinking about being really intentional about your structures is absolutely critical. And then potentially, depending on your budget, doing level setting early on with your kind of your early staff with something low cost that builds that shared language. Okay, we've just run over 1 minute. Thank you all so much for being here. If any of you have any questions at all, please feel free to email us. We'll send over an email after this, including some of the things that I've raised, so you do have that to hand. And of course, always happy to be in touch with anyone, depending on if you need us, or if you want to clarify, or if you just want to have a chat about something that's going on in your organization, very happy to be in touch at any point. It's been really wonderful to be here so early in 2023 with you all, and looking forward to many more. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Look after yourselves and take care.